This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
And thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to the talk. I'd also... No, yeah, I will, but there's something very important I want to say about that. I also want to thank just about all of the speakers who are on today's program, nearly all of whom have influenced my thinking about the Qur'an in one way or another. So thank you all very much for making me think anew about this text that's been with me since my childhood. Ladies and gentlemen, my aim today is to leave you feeling as happy as that guy right there. So let's hope it works. I should point out that I have a PowerPoint presentation, and there's a lot of text in said presentation. I thought it might be better to do it that way than to hand out a 5 or 6 page handout. So the people sitting in the back may or may not, but I think you should try to move forward just so you can see the text in question. I'll be reading the text as well, but it might help you to come closer if you want to do that now. So I guess nobody wants to. All right, fine, have it your way. Okay. Okay. So moving right along. Okay. There we go. Okay. I should also actually add a special word of thanks to Jonathan for some last-minute technical wizardry, which you will see later on. As you can see, my title has changed slightly. It's no longer Aspects of the Sale Translation. It's Thick Between Sale and Marachi. Ladies and gentlemen, today's paper grows out of some issues that were left out of my book, The Enlightenment Qur'an, and which have taken up an increasing amount of my time and attention recently. But the vague limited some of the detail that I wanted to add. Not that kept some readers from complaining about the microscopic. Anyway. Of the Qur'an as a text. In particular, I've sought to investigate not what the Qur'an means, but how it means. And this through the translation of certain keywords. What I hope to present to you today grows out of that exercise. It's very much a work in progress, so I hope you'll excuse whatever lacunae and loose ends might make their way into the argument. The talk falls into 2 parts. The first, a reflection on certain aspects of translation and interpretation. The second, actually focusing on a specific instance of translation in the Qur'an. From the Qur'an. I should also point out that arguments that invite thinking about the Qur'an in literary ways, by which I do not mean that the Qur'an is untrue, simply that there's a lot to be gained from paying attention to the poetic dimension of the text, an aspect that I hope will become clear in the course of the talk. Let me start by evoking a term coined by Kwame Anthony Appiah in a seminal article that he wrote about 2 decades ago. Yeah, it'd be really interesting. Namely, thick translation. The importance of this idea has been reiterated recently, actually not that recently, about 7 years ago, in a very interesting article by Theo Hermans, in an article whose full potential really has yet to be explored. Hermans finds thick translations in locations as varied as Erasmus's translation of the New Testament and Heidegger's essay on the Anaximander fragment. Appiah derives who borrowed the term thick description from Gilbert Ryle. Geertz called for thick description in response to one of the strongest currents of the late 60s and early 70s in the social sciences, namely the tendency to shoehorn complex and detailed data into universal structures. So thick description could therefore be understood as a kind of strong reaction to Lévi-Strauss and structuralism writ large. Geertz wanted an anthropology that prided itself on, and I quote, the delicacy of its distinctions, not the sweep of its abstractions, end quote. I've relied pretty heavily on Geertz in describing what sets George Sale and Ludovico Marracci apart from previous translations of the Qur'an, specifically the translation of André Durier. I argued that their descriptions of the Qur'an and Islam more generally were thicker, by which I meant that the multi-layered approach to the translation of the Qur'an, adding detailed account of Islamic history, theology, and most significantly tafsir, exegesis, to the translation of the text, constituted a quantum leap in the quality of the translation. The need for these additional layers in the translation of a sacred text stems from what Erich Auerbach calls their Deutungsbedürftigkeit, the fact that they are always in need of interpretation, that they call out for explanation. John Wansborough took this further in his decisive Quranic studies, where he states that the scriptural style is itself incomplete without commentary, for reasons that are partly syntactic and partly rhetorical. Now, the plot, if you'll pardon the pun, thickens with Appia. Appia begins with a consideration of Paul Grice's Grice's cooperative principle, namely required, and there's also the concomitant Gricean maxims, all of which purport to ways in which meaning is conveyed in language. The transmission of meaning depends as much on what is said as the conventions and beliefs surrounding it. Following the Gricean model, a good translation must somehow transmit the conventions, purposes, and belief systems that attach to a given utterance. Appia then moves on to consider those the Gricean mechanism fails. And the most important of these, in my opinion, is literature. For Appia, literary practice, like linguistic practice, is conventional, which is to say that it is governed by a specific structure. Unlike linguistic mechanism. One good example of this is the line of Pride and Prejudice. We do not have to believe that Jane Austen tells us that, quote, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife," end quote, in order to express her own ironic attitude to the relations of marriage, gender, and property. But we are plainly meant to rely on our understanding of the fact that an utterance of this sentence would convey that ironic attitude outside the fiction. This leads Appia then to consider what a good, thick translation ought to be. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of this is Appia's linking of linguistic and social concerns. The thickness of the translation, Appia argues, should aim at communicating to the reader why the work matters. It is not simply a question of linguistic accuracy or stylistic fluency, but rather a question of justification. Why is it that we human beings have these forms that ask us to simultaneously accept and suspend a writer's intentions? Or, I would add, the reality of the things to which the writer refers. More broadly, a translation aims to produce a new text that matters to one community the way that another text matters to another. But it's part of our understanding of why texts matter that this is not a question that convention settles. Indeed, it's part of our understanding of literary judgment that there can always be new readings, new things that matter about a text, new reasons for caring about new properties. Social values in mind. I want to make another detour, for reasons that will hopefully become clear, through the work of Paul Ricoeur and the notion of the world of the text as he deploys it, the notion of the world of the text as he deploys it in his work. For Ricoeur, every text opens up a world, a new dimension of reality. To speak of a world of the text is to stress the feature belonging to every literary work of opening before it a horizon of possible experience, a world in which it would be possible to live. A text is not something closed in upon itself. It is the projection of a new universe distinct from that in which we live. To appropriate a work through reading is to unfold the world horizon implicit in it, which includes the actions, the characters, and the events of the story told. As a result, the reader belongs at once to the work's horizon of experience and imagination, and to that of his or her own real action. So the world of the text distances the real from itself. This distancing of the real complicates reference. It's precisely the abolition of the ostensive function of language that makes things like literature possible for Ricoeur. This is not to say that literary texts have no referent, but it is to emphasize what happens when language moves from an oral mode, where a speaker can point to an object in the here and now, to a written one, where such references are necessarily taking place at some remove from the moment of utterance. It is in the space of that displacement that the world of the text unfolds to reveal multiple semantic possibilities. The task of interpretation for Ricoeur, or I would add the task of translation, which includes a very heavy dose of interpretation, then becomes that of the exploration of the world of that text. Furthermore, the creation of that world is what makes every text poetic in the strong sense of the term. Taking the word poetic back to its roots, poiein, to make, to create, Ricoeur argues that the poetic creative dimension is present in every text, as witness the world that that text makes or presents to us. This is especially true of sacred texts, which emerge in Ricoeur's reading as being the most creative texts of all. The distance at which the sacred text sets itself from everyday reality and quotidian vocabularies bolsters its capacity for carving out a wholly other, radically new world. The world of the literary, between quotes, text is a projected world that poetically distances itself from everyday reality. Is this not especially true of the new being projected and proposed by the Bible? Doesn't this new being make its way across the world of ordinary experience, and despite the closure of this experience? Isn't the strength of the projection of this world one of rupture and opening up? This being so, shouldn't we accord to this projection of the world a dimension that is poetic, in the strong sense of the term, that we also recognize in the matter of the text? In the world of the sacred text, we deal with idioms that transcend the commonplace and profane uses of language. Even in the context of organized religion, where language serves legal and liturgical functions, the category of the sacred is opposed to the use of language as a mere vehicle for the transmission of information. The complication of reference that Ricoeur locates in the operation of both the literary and sacred texts is all the more informative when it comes to the difficulty of identifying an exact referent for a given term. Neither the literary nor the sacred text suspends reference completely. Rather, they use reference that break with those of everyday language. According to Ricoeur, stories, tales, and poems are not without a referent. But this referent breaks with the referent of everyday language. In fiction, in poetry, new possibilities of being in the world are opened up in everyday reality. Fiction and poetry take aim at being, not in the mode of what is already there, what he calls l'être donné, but in the mode of what could be, le pouvoir être. In linguistic terms, what both the literary and sacred texts do is foreground what Ora Avni has called the resistance of reference, or the ways in which semiosis and deixis work at cross purposes in language. So, according to Avni, words may well aim at things, but their success is by no means guaranteed, nor is their failure. On the one hand, the rhetoricity of language blurs the distinction between things and consequently risks scrambling words. On the other, things and bodies oppose their opacity to the transparency of communication, their thingness to the selective abstraction required for naming. In other words, drawing a vector between a given word in any text, literary or sacred, and a given thing is difficult, fraught at best, and risks being confusing at worst. So much for the theory. Let me now move on to the practice. The Qur'an is a text that constantly invokes Ricoeur's opposition between the être donné and the pouvoir être, between what is given and what could be. The Qur'anic text has a very particular mode of being, somewhere between these two registers. Our task as readers and interpreters of the Qur'an inheres less in explaining the meaning of certain words or events than in understanding the fact that the Qur'an gives us a new way of experiencing the world and its many possibilities. So to focus on one of these particularly difficult reference, I'll be looking at a location in the geography of hell. I refer to Al-A'raf, the word that gives the 7th surah its title, and whose status, oscillating as it does between toponym and common noun, has exercised translators of the Qur'an over the years. The term itself has been variously understood to mean elevated place, crest, or if you use your etymology, the verb arafa or urf, it can also mean to distinguish between things or to part them. And the translators of the Qur'an over the years have used a variety of terms that reflect the range of possible meanings found among the exegetes who mention these two categories of meaning. I'll begin my itinerary through the Marrachi and Sale translations with the text of the Qur'an and its contemporary translation by Tarif Khalidi. So the verse reads, وَبَيْنَهُمَا حِجَابٌ وَعَلَى الْأَعْرَافِ رِجَالٌ يَعْرِفُونَ كُلًّا بِسِيمَاهُمْ وَنَادَوْا أَصْحَابَ الْجَنَّةِ أَنْ سَلَامٌ عَلَيْكُمْ لَمْ يَدْخُلُوهَا وَهُمْ يَطْمَعُونَ. In the Khalidi version, between them is a wall, which he translates as hijab, and upon its battlements, al-a'raf, are men who know each group by their outward visage. These call out to the people of the garden, peace be upon you. They have not entered it, though eager to do so. I should point out that the second word, them, in the English version, refers to the two groups, the people in paradise and the people in hell. Khalidi translates the term hijab by wall, which wall is then endowed with battlements, and it's those battlements that receive the name Al-A'raf. The word A'raf recurs 2 verses later in the phrase Ashab al-A'raf, which Khaldi translates as the people on the battlements, the inhabitants of al-A'raf. Now, during the early modern period, translators tended to use al-A'raf as a proper name, usually equated with purgatory. This is the case with Durier, Marrachi, and Sale. So to move to that period, and using Durier as a control for the sake of comparison, this is what we find. This is what the Durier translation looks like, by the way. I'm just going to point out where the text is, and then I'll actually give you a better slide. But basically, the verse in question is right here, and this thing on the side is actually a commentary, an exegetical gloss that I'll get to in a second. So, for Durier, and this is my retranslation of the French, between the blessed and the damned there is a separation and a place called Araf, or limbo, where there are many who recognize the blessed and the damned by their faces. They call them the blessed and salute them. Still, they do not enter paradise, even though they have a great desire to enter there. In his marginal note, Durier helpfully adds one of the explanations of who these inhabitants of Al-Araf might be. And this is something he would probably have found in the exegesis Tafsir al-Jalalain. He says, Mohammedan scholars believe that those who have done as much good as evil, and whose balance tilts neither towards good nor evil works, will stay in this place called Araf, along with those who have done neither good nor evil, and that this place is situated between paradise and hell. So basically, this is what the Durier translation does. It's an accurate but comparatively thin description of thin translation of the verse. We get something sharp, minimal, with some inmixing of interpretation to produce the smooth, fluent translations, the bel and fidèle, called for in the 17th century. Not literal, not word for word, but definitely smooth. Let us now move on to Marrachi. I don't actually have a page scan of the actual translation, but it's not particularly interesting. It's just endless sort of Latin text, which I've reproduced here. For Marrachi, and I should point out that the use of italics is a practice that Marrachi initiated, basically using italics to interpolate words that are not there in the original, but that are necessary for the interpretation. We don't get that that typographical distinction in Durier. So this is something that Marrachi begins and that continues into the Sale translation. And between them, that is between the blessed and the damned, shall be a veil, and on Al-Araf will stand men who know them all by their signs, and will cry out to the inhabitants of paradise, peace be upon you. Yet they will not enter therein, even though they themselves desire it. So far, so accurate. In his extensive notes to this section, he cites both the Tafsir al-Jalalain and another exegesis, Tafsir ibn Abi Zamanin, whom he calls Yahya, since the text is an epitome, an abridgment of another tafsir by Yahya ibn Salam, and the phrase Qala Yahya occurs, Yahya said, Yahya said, Yahya said, occurs regularly in that tafsir. So Marrachi uses all of this to the effect that the hijab and the Araf are effectively the same thing. The wall and the battlements are the same thing. And they both refer to the partition between heaven and hell. He then goes on to accuse Muhammad of simply plagiarizing the parable of Abraham and Lazarus as narrated in Luke 16, especially the part about the saved and the damned calling out to each other across the infinite chasm that separates them. We see this in, I'll show you where it is on, I just couldn't do any better than this. So this part right here is where he invokes Luke 16. And then the next part I'm going to get to is this part here where he actually brings in a hadith to explain the Araf. So Marrachi goes on to quote a lengthy hadith from Ibn Abi Zamanin that's worth exploring. And the hadith says the following. أن أحدا جبل يحبنا ونحبه وإنه يوم القيامة يمثل بين الجنة والنار يحبس عليه أقوام يعرفون كلا بسيماهم هنا ملائكة رجالا. Now I should explain the part that's in brackets قال محمد وكل مرتفع عند العرب أعراف is not translated by Marrachi. So he skips the section that says where Muhammad says that every, well, I'll read the whole translation, then I'll tell you. So Uhud is a mountain who loves us and that we love. On the day of judgment it will stand between paradise and hell. Upon it will be held persons who know all by their outward visage, all, God willing, people of paradise. And the people of the Araf, the people on the battlements, are male angels. The ellipsis refers to the part in brackets in the Arabic where it says Qala Muhammad said, every raised area, every mountain is called A'raf by the Arabs. Now, hadith about Jabal Uhud loving us and us exists in slightly different form in most hadith collections, either by itself, so just the first part, Uhud and Jabal yuhibbuna wa or with an additional sentence saying that other mountains overlook a lake. So the eschations do exist, but not explicitly linking it to the Quranic A'raf. So what does Marrachi do? He translates this tradition fairly accurately into Latin before adding an important line on the identification of the people of the A'raf, the people of the battlements, with male angels. He says, "This is, however, impossible. Mahometans admit the mystery of the incarnation, in which two natures are found in, or supposed to be united into, one person. For Marrachi, the contradictions of the Qur'an are such that they can only be saved, if that is the word, or resolved by Christian doctrine. And the translation of the Qur'an is, in the last analysis, a weapon in the Catholic Reformation." Baydawi's reading of the people of the A'raf, with which Marrachi would probably have been familiar. Al-Baydawi says, they are angels seen in male form, ملائكة يرون في صورة الرجال, which would at least obviate the need to invoke the mystery of the incarnation to explain their ontology, since for Al-Baydawi, the being, the usia, is angelic, and the appearance, or the finestai, is male and human. And then Marrachi adds further layers in his next section, the refutation, which looks something like this. So as you can see, there's a whole couple of pages of refutation, and the section I'm interested in is section 7 right here. But I reproduce this just to give you an idea of just how much refutation there is. There's really a great deal. And so he says, "It is indeed a great figment of the imagination, this wall them and in hell, or even dream of loving or being loved by a mountain. Since, moreover, according to the Mohammedans, in hell at the center, we're willing to understand all this figuratively or mystically, it might just be explicable. But so literally do they believe it that if anyone tries to twist its meaning allegorically or mystically, they brand him with charges of impiety and heresy." And it goes on like that for a couple of columns. So there's a great deal of this kind of material in the Marrachi translation. Let me now move on to the Sale translation, which looks like this. So basically, you get the text, etc., etc., which I'll get to in the next slide. So the text of the Sale translation says, "And between the blessed and the damned there shall be a veil." Notice the use of the italics, exactly the same way that Marrachi did. "And men shall stand Araf, who shall know every one of them by their marks, and shall call unto the inhabitants of paradise, saying, Peace be upon you, yet they shall not enter therein, although they earnestly desire it." I'll mention in passing that Sale's elegance is such that William Brinner, who wrote the article on the People of the Heights for the Encyclopedia of the Quran, still refers to it in his exposition of various strategies of translation. Sale's footnotes, typically more concise than Marrachi's, parse the verse to explain three things: Al-A'raf, the marks, and then the people of the A'raf, Ashab al-A'raf. So, he says, first footnote, Al-A'raf is the name of the wall or partition which, as Muhammad taught, will separate paradise from hell. But as to the persons who are to be placed thereon, the commentators differ, as has been elsewhere observed. The elsewhere refers to a lengthy passage in his very long preliminary discourse explaining the multitude of opinions regarding the identity and character of those who inhabit Al-A'raf. Sale adds, and I quote, "If Muhammad did not take his notions of the partition we have been describing from Scripture, he must at least have borrowed it at second hand from the Jews, who mention a thin wall dividing paradise from hell." End quote. And then in the second footnote, Sale reiterates traditions from Al-Baydawi, refers to Al-Baydawi to explain just what the marks might be. These marks, quote, "shall distinguish the blessed from the damned by their characteristics, such as the whiteness and splendor of the faces of the former and the blackness of those of the latter. End quote. It bears pointing out that we find the same tradition in Tafsir ibn Abi Zamanin, so it's not limited to al-Baydawi. And then finally, in a third footnote, Sale forges the link between the exclusion of Ashab al-A'raf and purgatory. He says, and I quote, "From this circumstance, it appears that their opinion is the most probable, who make this intermediate position a sort of purgatory for those who, though they deserve not to be sent to hell, yet have not merit sufficient to gain them immediate admittance into paradise, and will be tantalized there for a certain time with a bare view of the felicity of that place." There are no long passages explaining how Muhammad got it wrong, or how the Qur'an supposedly about the verse. The idea of the in this aspect of Muslim theology and its Judeo-Christian counterpart, largely the same information that we find in Marrachi, in less space, in a relatively thinner but somehow more useful translation than Marrachi's. So from all this, what am I asking you to conclude? It goes without saying that Sale is the better translator, despite the contrast between them makes clear that, beyond a certain threshold of information about history and exegesis, the thickness of a translation is not the only determinant of its quality. In addition to thickness, the translation must be faithful to the world of the text in the terms that Ricoeur laid out. And in so doing, rules out any possible justification. The idea of claiming that paradise and hell, be it a wall, it is. In this world, to paraphrase Wittgenstein, meaning might be better defined by use rather than naming. Mountains might be loved, and the dimensions of the post-resurrection universe are such that a mountain might stand between paradise, located in the seventh heaven, and hell, located in the center of the earth. Similarly, the distanciation operated by the Quranic text and its exegetical paratext, whereby the real is separated from itself to make way for a new otherworldly reality, complicates the ostensive functions of this language. In light of this distanciation, such statements as "these male angels embody the incarnation" lose their force, not because they're falsified, but rather because they become just one possible meaning and one possible take on the world of the text among many others. The Sale translation, by contrast, proves superior because it justifies the text, and does so in terms of what Ricoeur calls the pouvoir être of what can be. By yielding to the pouvoir être of the world of the text, Sale allows the reader to see why the particular combination of scripture and creed contained in this passage from Surat al-A'raf, good rewarded, evil punished, the two categories clearly separated, the possibility of a neutral ethical category, in sum, all of the implications that we might abstract from the scenario of al-A'raf in that verse actually matter to the Muslim community, and how that mattering might connect them to other Abrahamic monotheists. For Marrachi, on the other hand, even the parallels between the verse 46 of Surah 7 and Luke 16 can only stand as proof positive of Muhammad's falsity. The story of the translation of the Qur'an around the turn of the 18th century, therefore, is a tale of two translations. One translator explored the world of the text, only to slam the door shut behind him, while another points the way to that world and invites us to take a good look around. The sad thing about the Marrachi translation, given the wealth of information that it brings to bear on the Quranic text, is that it forecloses anything like exploration of that world. One cannot imagine anything like a new reading or a new appreciation of why the Qur'an matters emerging after making one's way, if one can stand to do so, through Marrachi's endless refutations. But one can, and one does do so, after reading Sale, which is probably one reason why generations of English readers and translators went back to him again and again. Sale's real value, I think, is that he gave us a proper translation of the Qur'an with just the right thickness, complete with the sort of information one would need to read and make sense of it and see why it matters to believing Muslims. I really hope it won't be long before we get another such translation, hopefully with the help of some of those present today. Thank you very much.